All right, let's talk about the topic of pricing because after all, no matter how well you sell, if you don't have the right unit economics, it doesn't make sense. So pricing, I would say first and foremost, the good news is it's not as complicated as you think it is. A lot of people have been brought up with the traditional mindset that if you grow your business, if you grow your audience, grow your customers, pricing can come later. But I would say in this day and age, even more so than ever, it's more important to figure out business model fit rather than worry about it later. Because if you don't get it right, then you have a very big and cumbersome machine that you're running that you are unable to sustain because you don't have the right models in place. So in this day and age, especially even with tech companies as well, most investors are a lot more reserved and they want to, at least at some very minimum level, even if you're not revenue generating yet, they want to know that you have a clear plan for monetization, and not only plan, but plans. So, what's your backup? What if this doesn't pan out the way that you predicted will? So yeah, I want to talk a bit about pricing because generally what I find is more than 90% of businesses that I work with tend to underprice to start, whether or not they're tech, service, or other, right? So first and foremost is we will go through two components of pricing. In this video, we will talk a bit about setting initial pricing, and then there'll be a follow-on video where I go into how to optimize pricing when we talk about revenue optimization. So first and foremost, the good news is it's not this random thing that you try and experiment with. There are very specific ways where you get to a number. And then from there are very scientific ways where you kind of optimize the right number as well. If you are not building let's say a venture scale business, if you're building, let's say, a lifestyle business, I would say even more so than ever, pricing is more important for you to get right, if not right per se, at least be on the right track on day one, because you want to be able to build a business that is ideally profitable right away, right? So that's totally okay as well. So let's talk a bit about initial pricing. When you're thinking about how you want to price your service initially, the first thing I want you to be mindful of is your company values. And this not only applies to pricing, but applies to any decision that you make with your company, whether or not it's which client you choose to work with, which partner or vendor that you want to partner up with. Maybe it's even things like who to hire. Always let your company values inform those decisions, because I'll give you some examples in a second, but you'll understand how important values are, because you're not just trying to achieve a goal at all means, even in a way that is, let's say, unethical, right? So let's take a look at pricing and company values as an example. So the common understanding in and around best practice for pricing is buyers psychology dictates that buyers will perceive that a price that is, let's say, a $299 is much more valuable than a $300 price, because naturally they feel like that's the lower price point, even though they know that the company is actively doing this as a manipulative tactic, right? But if your company's core values are not centered around value as in like good savings, and if your company's core values are more centered around quality and you want to communicate that with your customer, then it actually makes sense to not follow this specific model and deliberately price at the 300 or up mark as opposed to the 299, or let's say, what a lot of companies nowadays do is like, let's say 279.65 or something like that, right? So always understand what your values are, and then from there, let that dictate how you are going to price as well. So I'll give you some other examples that are related to company values and decision making that are not pricing specific, but I think are very important for you to make sure that you get correctly at this point in time. So related to sales, let's say, for example, if your company's values are security and privacy, if one day you get a project where the government decides to work with you, and it's going to be a huge project because, number one, it's government, so it's not only a big dollar value, but also, it's going to be big for your credibility, and it's also going to be very stable, right? It's going to be a project that's going to be long term. But the government department says, hey, if you work with us, we want you to disclose all of the data and make it public. If that is not align with your company's values, you may deliberately decide to forego the opportunity in favor of being true to your values. And that is totally okay. I don't want you to think that money is everything, because you have to remember everything that you say yes to is effectively a no to something else. There may be other clients that are also aligned with your values, that are a better fit, that are also going to potentially be large, good for your credibility, big dollar value, and also long-term projects that you have effectively said no, because you have basically communicated to the market that you are not a company that is true to your values. So at the end of the day, like, build a company that you want to run. Don't purely go after money. And the same goes for even, let's say, marketing related decisions. So one example here that I can think of that is immediate to me is Nike and their decision to support Naomi Osaka, despite her decision to pull out of the I forgot which one it was. I think it was Wimbledon, due to mental health reasons. So obviously, like, if you're a big company like that, you would have already sponsored the athlete. You would have expected that the athlete represent you and your brand in the competition. But by staying true to their values in and around supporting athletes, both not only financially but also with their mental health, I would say that decision actually did a lot more for them business-wise than it did for them having her perform on the stage with their products. Make sense? So at the end of the day, you want to try to understand your values and let that inform decisions that you make, because it communicates a lot more to your customers and kind of to not only externally, but also to your employees as well. So the second thing to think about as you evaluate pricing is not only your company values, but also your objectives. Objectives are slightly different from values, because you can have very specific either short-term or long-term objectives. And this example here is, let's say, for example, if you prioritize growth, let's say in this year. So maybe, for example, you're doing this because you plan on raising a round of funding in the immediate coming year, or maybe you plan on selling your company soon, whatever the reason. If you have very specific goals, you may favor certain decisions over others, and that is okay as well. But obviously, you want to make sure that these goals are also aligned with your values. But then, let's say if your goal is to focus on growth, then it is okay for you to take a hit on the pricing side of things in order to have a lower entry point, such that you can grow your user base much more quickly. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you want to make sure that it is intentional, that you're not just pricing for the sake of pricing and then figuring out later that, oh no, I priced too low. If you know why you're pricing the way you're pricing, then you can set expectations in and around how you're communicating with customers. And then when you do move down the line where you eventually have to bump up the price, it's not going to come as a surprise to them as well. So good expectation setting, which we will talk about more in one of the later videos, is really key to keeping people happy, especially if you're going to make changes, i.e. pricing changes related to this specific video down the line. So what are your goals? So start to think about those as well. The third tip that I want to give before I go into the actual ways to actually set the initial pricing is don't reinvent everything. And the reason why I like to say this, especially to entrepreneurs, is most business owners are usually very creative people, very innovative. They're usually trying to do something new, whether or not they've launched a new product or service that is non-existing, or maybe they are serving an underserved market that's not currently being served by other competitors, or maybe they're just doing business in a different way or solving the same problem in a very unique and different way. The end goal, I would say, is if you're already trying new things in many different areas of your business, you don't have to reinvent everything, because the more variables you have, the more uncertainty you have, the more you put yourself at risk, right? So don't try to do everything in a new way. If there are tried and proven methods of pricing, then start with that. Obviously, you can optimize, you can tweak, you can adjust, because perhaps your target audience is different and it requires a different pricing model. That is totally okay as well. But start with what has been tried and tested to begin with, just to reduce your risk, and then you can optimize later, right? So there are two main things that you want to do when it comes to pricing. Obviously, I'm kind of skipping over a third one, which is everything that I've talked about so far is understanding kind of your values, your objectives, and kind of how much you want to get paid for, right? So the first and second step that are not inclusive of those things that I just talked about is number one is understanding kind of what is the market rate. And the in and around market rate here is you need to understand the market landscape. So who are your competitors, whether it be direct competitors or indirect, right? How do they price? And not only how do they price, as you are going out, since you're doing this exercise anyways, you might as well figure out how they convert their prospects as well. So kind of the assignment or homework number one is go out there and do some mystery shopping, go out and find some potential competitors. Even if you're in a space where you think like no one is my competitor, look for an indirect competitor. So if you're not familiar with what an indirect competitor is, an example is, let's say if you're opening up a bowling alley, another bowling alley is a direct competitor, but a movie theater is an indirect competitor. They're also going after your customers' same budget for entertainment, right? So go after that indirect competitor or direct and look at how they price, number one, and then number two, look at how they convert. So that you can kind of mimic or figure out, are certain channels effective? What kind of copy, what language do you use? What's the process and workflow? Those kind of things. Assignment number two is now that you have one lens on what the marketplace looks like, you need to look at what customers expect. That is the second view. So in most cases, hopefully, if you are at this stage and you're thinking about pricing, you have ideally already done some level of kind of market research and market validation. So I don't talk about this in this course, but basically market research is, understanding what's the potential market size, understanding, the competitors, those kind of things. But market validation is more in and around understanding, does the customer actually have the problem? Do you actually have demand for a product or service, right? So I won't go into methodology around customer discovery, but let's assume you've done some customer discovery. You've spoken to some customers, you kind of understand what they value, what they care about, how they view your solution. Now, this is a good time for you to go into what we call round two of customer discovery. Customer discovery is a practice that should never end with a business. It's something that's living and breathing. You should always get feedback. But in and around here, what you're trying to understand is you need to understand how customer perceives pricing, not necessarily pricing in general, but pricing for your solution, right? So this is a good time for you to go back to people that you've interviewed previously, or maybe even new prospective customers as well. And the idea is it doesn't have to be a formal interview that you sit down and just ask these questions to them, but you need to gauge their reaction to try to understand or try to kind of determine what they view as acceptable, what is expensive, and what is outrageous. So most companies generally will find that they will price in the middle. They will find that, okay, the expensive range is kind of the sweet spot. Anything that's acceptable is probably underpricing. Anything that is outrageous is probably too expensive, right? But again, remember, tie it back to your company values and your objectives. If your goal is to sell to a premium or exclusive market, then it is totally okay for you to start with that outrageous price point, even if that will result in you excluding people who are only willing to pay up to that expensive price point, right? Because that's fine. It's okay to say no to certain customers. Maybe they're not your ideal target customer. Maybe they're not good early adopters. So at the end of the day, be intentional with it, because you don't want to end up in a situation where you just say yes to every single client because you are trying to just scrape by and make sure that the business is functioning. You want to make sure that you select for the right clients so that you can build a business that is going to grow in a healthy way. So yeah, not only do you want to understand their expectations around the dollar value, but the second piece is understanding how they want to pay that money. So are they familiar with paying a percentage of the transaction? Do they pay by hour? Do they pay a flat fee for a project? Do they want to pay upfront before you execute? Do they want to pay in installments? Let's say a portion upfront, a portion during execution, and a portion after delivery. Who knows? But the goal is to really understand what the expectation is, because if you differ too much from what they expect, then it can actually be detrimental to how they perceive value in your product or service. And one example that really stands out here is there's a recent Master of Scale episode. So that's the podcast from Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn. And he was talking about his interview with the founders of Warby Parker. And the founders of Warby Parker, in that time when they started the business, eyeglasses were in the couple of $1,000s range. And they wanted to be able to bring cheap, affordable glasses because they found that given their experience and research and really understanding the manufacturing process, to create a pair of lenses and glasses is actually very, very affordable. The same factories that manufacture those designer glasses produce glasses at a fraction of the cost, and a fraction being only like around, like, I think it was $35, $45. But obviously, like when in the interview, they talk about swinging that by their professor when they were still students in university, and their idea got immediately shut down, because if you're having such a big discrepancy in pricing, that also affects customer perception, and customer will start to question, why is it so affordable? Is it because it's low quality? Is it because there's some problems with this company? Who knows? So ideally, you don't want to be too far in deviation from what the customer expects. And it's not just purely based on what you can price at. So having a slightly higher price point will also make it just a bit more healthy for your business as well. So just understand what customers expect and kind of how do you convey value in and between that. So they basically ended up in a situation where they priced around $100, and they did it because they did a bunch of surveys, and they found that most people found that they were more comfortable with that price point, and they found it as being both affordable but also reasonable as well. So if you look at it, the first one here is your pricing based on the marketplace. The second one is your pricing based on customer expectation. I would say it's valuable for you to do both, so that you have insight on both what the marketplace looks like and both what customers expect, in order to come up with an informed decision on how you will do your pricing. The second thing I want to say in and around here is, as you do your interviews or your discovery, if at all possible, I recommend doing in-person or live interviews rather than surveys, because there's certain information that you don't get from a survey. So the example or story I can remember here is there's this entrepreneur that I worked with in the past, and they created a platform that would connect brands with influencers. So if, let's say, Nike is looking for the best influencer that speaks to an audience of like young women between the ages of 16 to 25 that live in Australia that like to look at handbags, for example. So what the founder, she would actually go out and she would speak to the brands in person if she could. And I remember her telling the story of when she would throw pricing in front of them, and she would say, okay, this is our service, this is how much it costs. And immediately she can tell from their reaction how they perceive pricing. Because obviously, if she priced too low, they would just jump on it immediately. If she priced too high, she could see them hesitating. And she found that the sweet spot is where the ideal clients that she was going after had some level of hesitancy, but were also keen on jumping in. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're underpricing because you're leaving money on the table. Or number two, if you are overpricing, then it either means that number one, people don't see a match in value of what your product or service is offering to the justification of the value in terms of monetary value that they have to sacrifice in order to solve the problem. So if you can, try to do these kind of things in person, because like if you put out a survey in and around pricing, like you can't gauge body language in a survey. People just say yes or no. And it's hard to ask you, for you to ask them to elaborate. Make sense? So the other thing that also affects pricing is, so we talked a bit about, the marketplace, customers. The third one that really affects pricing as well, especially if you are a solopreneur, if you're a freelancer, is kind of our personal relationship with money. Even if you're a founder building a large venture scale business, I would say to a degree this is also part of the factor, because a lot of us have certain baggage that we attach to what money means. For some, maybe they're building a social venture and they feel that they don't want to just be profitable for the sake of profitability, and they want to make sure that they're building a business that can actually make the world a better place, which is all fine and dandy. But you want to make sure that, I remember a quote from a speaker: you can't help the homeless by joining them, right? So you need to still build a business that is sustainable in order to add the value that you're trying to add or create in the world. The other thing is, some of us have certain hesitancies that are not related to necessarily who we are serving in the market, but maybe it's, you feel that if you are charging too expensive, you're seen as being greedy. Some people feel that they are not worth as much, i.e. imposter syndrome. Therefore, they feel it difficult to justify a higher price. So just be careful about some of these, what's the best word for it? Kind of limiting beliefs that will affect how we view pricing. So some of the more common limiting beliefs, I've talked a bit about imposter syndrome. So that's in and around confidence and kind of what you define as being valuable. I have a separate blog on like how to identify imposter syndrome and kind of what are some steps that you can take to try to mitigate it, but I won't talk too much about imposter syndrome here. The other one is, I've alluded to it before when I talk a bit about, let's say, social ventures. So yes, obviously, if you want to go after serving, let's say, a less fortunate market, that is entirely fine. But that doesn't mean that you should underprice, because if you underprice, then you are building a business that is not going to be sustainable, and you are going to be struggling to keep up with business and not only pay yourself, but because you are forced to say yes to every potential project, you end up underserving the people that are underserved to begin with. So another model that you can possibly approach it with is, you can price more fairly, both to yourself, but maybe you will be serving a separate market. But what you'll do is then you'll have a designated amount of spots or capacity where you can work with, let's say, those underserved clients. So either at a discounted rate, or maybe it's even free, right? So that way, then at least your pricing to be sustainable, you have that business growth, you have that luxury, and you are able to do charity and do good work while being in a comfortable position where you are not lacking anything. Make sense? So that way, then the quality of your work will also be a lot better. So I think one last tip before we kind of move on to some of the finer details around pricing is also consider what is the value that you're creating as you look at your price. This is most common in, I find, either product businesses or service businesses, i.e. consultants. They generally look at, okay, what's the cost of goods? So they look at the manufacturing costs, shipping, those kind of things. Or let's say they're looking at their billable hourly rate, and they're looking at how much time it will take to execute on the project. What I generally find is that if you price purely based on cost, usually your business will not scale as effectively as if you priced based on value for your customer. So I'll give one example here just to give you an understanding of what that might look like. Actually, I'll give you a few examples. So one is actually a real example. One entrepreneur that I know, she runs workshops, and what she would do is she would actually charge based on number of attendees in those corporate workshops. And then she had this opportunity to work with a much larger and reputable company. In this case, it was EA Games. So obviously with EA Games, they are a much more established company. They have a larger budget. They have a lot more employees, but not only that, like whatever she's delivering in her workshops will actually translate to a lot more value for the company, because they're doing, number one, much more business. Number two, they have a much larger team. Therefore, the impact of her workshop is going to be a lot stronger as well. It doesn't make sense for her to keep the same pricing model that is purely based on number of bumps and seats, right? Number of participants. So consider, how are you measuring value? How are you defining value for your customer? Because if you can scale based on the success that your customer gets, the customer is, number one, obviously more willing to pay you more money because they are being more successful or becoming more successful. And number two is you can just grow your business a lot more because it's not limited just based on cost. Because sometimes value will scale disproportionately based on, to cost. So the examples here, or at least rough rule of thumbs that you can think of as you are thinking about value-based pricing, is generally for most businesses, and it's not limited to these 4 ways, but typically how you create value for a client is usually one of the 4, right? Usually you can help them make more money, generate more revenue, or maybe you're helping them save more money, or you're making things easier for them. It's less difficult for them, they save energy, less stressful for them, or maybe you're saving them time. So a rough rule of thumb, if you just need like numbers to put things to, is if you're helping a customer make more money, you can probably aim for the range of about 10 to 25% of their expected additional monthly income for your profits. Let's say if you're helping them save money, then probably around like 10 to 15% of the annual savings. If you're helping them save time, then it's a bit trickier. You need to try to identify what their time is worth. What is roughly their quote unquote hourly worth? Or if it's not an hourly worth that you can calculate, what sort of opportunity cost is associated to the time that they are losing doing certain things. So for example, if you have a tool that helps people automate a task that takes 2 hours to perform an admin task, that 2 hours, if a sales rep could spend it selling and closing deals, what is the lost opportunity cost? And you can try to aim for about 10% of that. So one example I can give you that's very specific is there's this recycling company that I worked with in the past, and they basically work for, their clients are events and music festivals. And what they would do is basically, if you're running, let's say, a music festival, for example, they would come in, they would have bins, they would have volunteers to help you sort the recycling. And how they would quote their clients is, when I first met them, they were quoting based purely on cost. So for example, if let's say it's a 3-hour event, let's say it's a 100-person event, they look at, okay, how long is the event? How big is the space? How many bins do we need? How many volunteers do we need? So from there, they calculate a cost. So they say, okay, 3 hours, we need 3 volunteers, and the volunteers are there for 3 hours, therefore we will charge X dollars. And this doesn't necessarily scale for a larger event. So let's say, for example, if you have a 500-person event, the venue might not be 5 times as large. They may not need 5 times more bins. Maybe they're able to service a 500-person event with 2 bins. And if they stayed based on their existing model, which was purely cost-based, then they wouldn't be able to scale as much. So I encourage them to shift their pricing to more around not only number of attendees, but also the ticket value for the events. And by doing their quotes that way, that allowed them to scale much more quickly, because now, let's say it's a 500-person event, even though they only need, let's say, 6 volunteers for 3 hours, because it's also a 3-hour long event, if they're charging based on the number of tickets sold and the value of the tickets, they are scaling with the success of their client as well. The client has a bigger event, they have a larger budget, they're making more money, they're happy to pay you more money as well, right? So it helps you scale your profit a lot better. And that really helped that nonprofit unlock a lot of growth, because they were really stuck kind of in survival mode, just trying to get to make ends meet in terms of both profit and tying in with the cost. So consider how you can reflect the value that you're creating for your customers. The last kind of thing I want to talk about is in and around, as you think about value-based pricing, one model that you can consider if it applies to you is what we call usage-based pricing, UBP. This example here is let's say in tech, because it's most common in tech, but also applicable to, let's say, service as well, or products. Generally, the traditional model is what we call a freemium model. So you usually have a free tier, and then you have a premium tier or premium tiers. And how the tiers typically work is the traditional model is to tier based on features. So if you need to upgrade to pro features, then you pay a certain amount. And maybe there's like a, let's say, executive level feature, or let's say a corporate level feature. and then those unlock different set of features. The challenge with tier-based pricing is, number one, it assumes that all of those extra features that you're building in are features that are needed by your customer. Number two, your power users may not be the same as your regular users. So to me, it doesn't make sense because you're generally going after two different customers, but then you're spending all of your marketing efforts aiming it towards like the general user. So what is gaining more popularity nowadays is what we call UBP, usage-based pricing. And it's based on, number one, you want a tier based on the usage metrics that will scale as your customer grows. So the example here is, let's say Zapier. Zapier is an automation solution software. So as you can see over here, what they do is it's free for a certain number of tasks or automations. And then the more tasks or automations you have, then you pay a certain amount and it scales accordingly, right? So obviously this reflects in your client's growth as well. Ideally, whatever usage-based metric you decide to price around is a usage-based pricing, is a usage-based metric that scales as they grow their organization as well. Because obviously the more they grow, that means the more success they have, that means the more budget they have as well. But then number two, if you purely base your pricing on usage and you're not mindful about a metric that is scaling with their success, then you might end up in a situation where they are hesitant to use your product or solution more because they know that more usage comes with higher price. And if they are not able to afford that higher price, then it actually puts you in a bad situation where they're more likely to churn or leave and go to competitor. So you want to make sure that the metric that you use is a good metric that actually indicates that they're seeing more success in your business as well. Make sense? So yeah, be a bit mindful about this. And once they have hit that milestone, then that's a good opportunity for you to come in and do that quote unquote upsell and upgrade them to the next tier or the next level. Other common examples are, let's say, Dropbox with amount of storage or Google. So I want to end the initial pricing discussion with a quick talk on discounting, because some of you may have to do this, although ideally you want to try to avoid discounting. Every company does it at some point. So a couple of things in and around discounting. So I'm not going to talk about buyer psychology and kind of like how people perceive discounts, because I do believe that to a degree, some of that is purely manipulative and it's not authentic. Instead, what I encourage you to think about is as you discount, generally discounting also reduces the perceived value of your product or service. So if you can, I actually encourage you to, instead of discounting, take a value add approach. So this example over here is, as you can see with the traditional model, let's say you say 10 hours of service, $100. 20 hours of service, instead of being $200, it's 180. So you get a discounted rate. A value added approach is, let's say 10 hours of service, $100, 20 hours of service, still $200, but I'm giving you 3 free hours. So you're giving a bonus. That way people feel like they're getting more, as opposed to feel like they're getting a lower quality of the same thing. Make sense? So think about how you can kind of maintain the same perceived value, but maybe make them feel like, or exceed the expectation, make them feel like they're getting a nice bonus. Other things that you can think about as you explore discounting is you could also adjust not only how much in terms of a value number or dollar value that you take from a customer, but also how you choose to collect that money as well. So for example, obviously with, let's say, COVID, there were a lot of businesses that couldn't afford some payments because, let's say, they had lower cash flow because pockets got tighter, people couldn't do it in person, and who knows, God knows what else. And even now we are moving into recession. It's entirely possible for you to find that you have vendors, clients, customers that are working with tighter pockets. So consider how you can also be flexible with your payment terms. So maybe instead of taking payment now or upfront, maybe you're doing a financing plan. Maybe you're spreading out your payment over a period of time with a small interest. Or maybe you are addressing the perceived risk that they have, right? A good example of that is during the 2008 recession, Hyundai, what they did is the main concern on a lot of people's minds was, not necessarily money. It was more about people worrying about losing their jobs. So what they did is they offered a job loss guarantee. If you lose your job after you've purchased a car, you can return the car, no questions asked. And this addressed the customers' fears and concerns, and it allowed those customers to actually take that leap. And this allowed Hyundai to leap over a lot of their competitors in the marketplace during that time. So consider how else you can be flexible. Maybe it's other things like sharing in some of the risk and reward. Maybe you do profit sharing, right? Maybe you're revenue sharing, or maybe you're bundling services. So there are many other creative ways to kind of do a discount without undercutting yourself. Make sense? So last thing is, don't worry about getting everything perfect to start. Pricing is not a one-time thing. It is definitely okay for you to change pricing over time. And as long as you set the right expectations and you do it authentically, customers are usually okay with you changing pricing as well. So as a matter of fact, like, pricing will never be perfect. Every company is going to change pricing over time. So don't be afraid of changing pricing. Yeah, just go out there, start to do some of those assignments I talked to you about, and start with an initial pricing. Hopefully it's a healthy price. Ideally, you don't want to end up underpricing too much. And then from there, like I say, most companies tend to generally underprice. So the question is how much you underprice by, right? So it's okay if you underprice. That's not the end of the world. It's okay if you overprice too. It's not the end of the world. We can adjust over time. So that's it for this video. Tune in for the next video to talk a bit, where I'll be talking a bit more about how you optimize your pricing.